Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going to talk about this officer, Francis Skinner Frank Fiske, the Lieutenant Colonel of the 2nd New Hampshire Infantry. I have two colorful anecdotes that I found about him involving the first battle of Bull Run or the Battle of Manassas, depending upon how you want to frame it. The first anecdote is about him with his coat off, sleeves rolled up, perspiring as his men are in the thick of the battle. The second anecdote is an exchange with then Colonel Ambrose Burnside, who is in charge of the regiment to which the 2nd New Hampshire belongs. The first anecdote, the one about him with his sleeves rolled up and perspiring, appears in the regimental history of the 2nd. It's about a page long in the book, and I want to read it to you because it gives you context around the battle. It also explains how he came to be in the position he was in. It also includes a name that you need to know. It's Gilman Marston. He's the colonel of the 2nd who is wounded in the action. So here we go. Quote, "We filed into a field upon the right of the road, fired a few scattering shots at a line of skirmishers which opened on us, and then threw ourselves upon the ground to escape the fire of a rebel battery upon the opposite slope, which had begun to pay attention to us. By this time, the Rhode Island battery was in position and opened fire. Its first shot was directed against the battery which was annoying us, and with splendid accuracy. The shell struck right upon the little work behind which the gunners were protected, and the demoralized artillerists streamed to the rear like ants from an anthill. But they were rallied by the officers and led back to their work. They soon got good range upon us, and many a poor fellow was carried gasping and bleeding to the rear. For half an hour we suffered this merciless pelting, when the enemy showed themselves in great numbers in front of the Rhode Islanders, evidently intending to charge the battery, and we were ordered to the left of the road to assist in repelling the threatened attack. Colonel Marston was at this moment consulting with Colonel Burnside. 'Attention, left face, double quick march,' shouted Colonel Fiske, who, in his shirt sleeves and with perspiration pouring from his face, had been striding up and down the line. As we rushed past the battery, we were exposed to the concentrated fire of the entire rebel force then in action, and the sounds of their missiles running through the whole scale of warlike music, from the savage rush of 12-pound shells to the spiteful pish of the mini bullet, was ruinous to weak nerves. We reached our position amidst this galling fire and threw ourselves upon the ground to await any demonstration. It soon came. Along the edge of the woods, some 300 yards in front of the battery, the rebels appeared in strong force. The two howitzers of the 71st opened with grape and shrapnel, while we rose from the ground and, rushing with the 71st over an intervening fence and through a cornfield, engaged in a sharp fight with the rebels. It was hot work for a short time. They were under cover of the woods, we fully exposed to their aim. They soon fell back, but not until the green leaves of the growing corn had been dyed red with the northern blood and ground strewn with corpses." So there's that first anecdote of Fiske in the thick of the action. The second anecdote, this comes from a newspaper article from a Vermont publication called the St. Johnsbury Caledonian. In its August 9th, 1861 issue, you'll find this news brief. There's a reference to Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, the aging commander, Mexican war veteran, known as Old Fuss and Feathers, though not to his face, and Colonel Ambrose Burnside, who I mentioned earlier. So here's this news brief. Quote, "The New Hampshire 2nd Regiment covered itself with glory at Manassas. Both General Scott and Colonel Burnside have expressed the warmest approbation of the extraordinary firmness and steadiness of the regiment while under galling fire and during the retreat. Colonel Marston was severely wounded in the beginning of the engagement at Bull Run, and although gallantly returning to the field, the command devolved upon Lieutenant Colonel Fiske. Colonel Burnside himself relates that, testing the resources of his brigade, he said to Colonel Fiske, "Will your men obey such and such an order?" To which Colonel Fiske replied, "My men will obey any order." So there you have the words of Colonel Fiske himself. If you put the two anecdotes together, they had to have come right after one another. So you're in the middle of the action. Rhode Island batteries in action. The rebels are coming forward. The Rhode Island men, the New Hampshire men, the 71st New York, all these regiments are in action. Colonel Marston suffers a wound. It's actually a bullet in his shoulder, taking him out of action. Command devolves to Fiske, and he's in his shirt sleeves, perspiring off of his face, and Burnside looking for that moment of confidence, perhaps as much as himself as anyone else, but also to inspire Fiske, asks him about obeying the order. And of course, Fiske's reply, "My men will obey any order," says it all. Now, mention one more thing here. I am pretty interested in the first battle of Bull Run because up until that time, there was sort of a general belief that the war was going to be of short duration and there was going to be a knockout blow. I think this had to do with the fact that folks were just naive about war. They didn't really know what was involved, although 15 years earlier had been the war with Mexico. Still, a war on our own land, our own country. Folks really didn't know what it was all about. They didn't understand that war was violent. Still carriages rolling out from Washington, D.C. to watch it as if it was a spectator sport. Of course, was nothing like that. And it was in this battle that we learned that this is not going to be a short war. We learn that the Confederate Army is serious about defending its land. And we learn that the Union Army has a lot to go, a long way to go to perfect its fighting acumen. So, what about Fiske? Let's talk about him. And I want to talk about this photograph. Fiske was born in Keene, New Hampshire in 1825, graduated from Dartmouth in 1843, and earns a law degree from Harvard a few years later, embarking on a law career in Keene. He's also active in his local light infantry, a militia company, which is maybe where he gets some of the rudiments of the art of war. A family genealogist noted that he paused his career around 1849 and in 1850, quote, was captured by Arabs and for some time held a prisoner. Returning home after his escape, he engaged in business in Boston. It's an interesting, unusual comment. Where exactly Fiske was, I have yet to been able to find out, but the date is curious. 1849. That's the gold rush. You got the gold rush going on, and a bunch of Easterners, those folks back east, are inspired by Wanderlust and want to go find out what's going on in the gold fields of California and elsewhere. Maybe he was heading out west and took a ship to go around the tip of South America. Don't know. Whatever happened, I don't even know if they were Arabs or if that's just sort of a term that was used to capture some foreign body that took him prisoner. We'll continue the research on that. But anyway, let's continue. When the war comes, he goes back to Keene from Boston, joins the 2nd New Hampshire as the original lieutenant colonel. Following the first battle of Bull Run, and I'm going to get to the photo here in a minute, I'm going to tell you where I believe it was taken. Marston goes home to recuperate, and the regiment goes to Bladensburg, Maryland, around early August of 1861, just after the battle. They go to Bladensburg to rest, recuperate. They go to an encampment. Bladensburg is just outside of DC. And so at some point, after setting up camp and before Marston returns to the regiment, Fiske, I believe, posed for this portrait. If you look closely, you'll see stenciled above the canvas flap is Colonel in all caps, 2nd New Hampshire Volunteers. Fiske didn't officially hold the rank of colonel. He was lieutenant colonel, and he was filling in for Marston while he was away. So I'm pretty sure that this is when it was taken. Another little detail I want to share with you that you'll find interesting is this image that appears in Fiske's 1907 obituary. And look, it's the same tent, just we're panning out a little bit, and there's other folks that are in the picture. You've got two unidentified men, considered, or at least in the caption, they're identified as his aides. Fiske is also holding a horse. One of the aides is holding a horse. But if you look closely, you'll see it's the same tent, similar, it looks like the same trees in the background, the raised platform on which the tent is mounted, the dirt in the foreground, all of this is the same view. Now, I want to show you the image in its entirety. This is the original albumen print that is on a mount, a cardboard mount, and you'll see that the cardboard mount is barely visible, and that's because it has been trimmed right up to the edges, literally to the edges of the photo. There's only a little bit of the mount available along the top and the bottom, and the reason it was trimmed was by the person who inserted it into a photo album. This was fairly common, where folks, when they were putting albums together, would trim the edges of the pictures so they could be easily inserted into these very thick album sleeves. In fact, album producers inserted a little card in those albums telling people to trim the images, which worked for them, but oftentimes valuable information will get cut off. I believe that some of the valuable information believing in this, that's part of this image, was part of the mount, and that in fact it was part of Matthew Brady's first series, Illustrations of Camp Life, which was produced between roughly May of 1861 and the spring of 1862. And the reason I say that is because it looks very similar to other images that were part of that series. Here's one of them of a soldier, and you can see this is largely untrimmed. And when you see the mount in its entirety, you'll see the imprint, Illustrations of Camp Life, and then on the bottom left in small print, Brady, on the opposite side, Washington. So this limited series that Brady's team produced involved them going around to forts around the defenses of Washington and other encampments to take images, to take photographs of these Union soldiers, the first responders, the first defenders of the Union in Washington, D.C. We oftentimes think of Brady and his pictures of Antietam, Gettysburg, and elsewhere. He really got to start with the Washington, D.C. Illustrations of Camp Life series. So that's my thinking. And Fiske remained in the colonel's position, though not officially, until Marston's return, which I believe was sometime in very late 1861 or very early 1862. So the final chapter of this saga is what became of Fiske. Well, he actually didn't last much longer in the army. And let's go back here to see his wartime image. Fiske's service ends in October 1862 when he's forced to resign because he has a camp fever, which is very likely typhoid fever. It took a toll. Recall, he was born in 1825. He's in his late 30s, maybe not in the most robust of health. Whether you were 40 years old or 18, fever, typhoid is going to take a toll. Anyway, In Fiske's case, he couldn't handle it. He couldn't withstand the rigors of camp and campaign, so he resigns. He returns to business in Boston, and somewhere around 1870, he receives an appointment as the bankruptcy clerk in the U.S. District Court in the city. He serves in this capacity for 34 years. And I want to share this image, which comes out of the same obituary, from which the image of him with his aides in Bladensburg. So here you can see, as a much older man wearing a nifty fez like hat, holding what appears to be a newspaper. He served as the bankruptcy clerk in the district court for something like 34 years, until poor health, he was in his upper 70s by that time, intervened. He was very active in the Grand Army of the Republic and the Military Order of the Loyal Legion. He was admired as a modest and reserved man with a large group of warm and loving friendships. When he passed at age 81, he was widely mourned. His death made front page news in newspapers, and he was survived by a son and 3 daughters. So there you have it, the story of Frank Fiske, covered in glory with his regiment, the 2nd New Hampshire, at the Battle of First Bull Run. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.